Ding, ding, ding. Okay, welcome back. I'd like to, moving straight on, introduce you. Well, many of you will also already know Dr. Michelle Farrow, who's an academic and paediatric neurologist at Sydney Children's at Randwick. Michelle spoke here last year about the very exciting results of clinical trials in spinal muscular atrophy, and we've invited her back to reflect on what happens when a clinical trial actually works. Please welcome Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you for... No, don't. So, first of all, thank you for asking me to come, and it's a delight to come and spend some time with you, but I apologise it's so short today due to my second job as Uber driver. But I think my brief from Christy was to keep it very informal, and so I have really want to take questions and be interrupted as much as possible, and I don't mind that, and I would actually rather that. Yeah, thank you. But having some preparation in case people don't interrupt me, I thought I'd better have a backup plan B, which are the karaoke slides. Clinical trials, just in definition, are research studies, and it's determining whether a drug, a device, or like exercise actually is safe and effective for use in humans. And so it goes through various phases to get to where we got to with Spinraza. And I just wanted to walk you through that. And it can be a very long time. In fact, if you add it all up, it can be up to 15 years. So Spinraza seemed to happen a little bit faster, and I think that was because of the need. There were many years of drug discovery in the lab, from test tubes then to animals, and then phase 1 is where it starts in a very small number of humans, and it's really to find a dose and to see if it's safe. And then if it appears to be safe, you won't know if it works yet, and you think you have a dose, you go to phase 2 where you involve more people. And then if you think that it's still potentially going to be safe, then you go to phase 3 where you test more people and you're measuring whether it works or not. So, of course, if you can imagine if it's a 6 to 7 year battle, and I think with Spinraza, which is now on the PBS for children with spinal muscular atrophy, first patient was dosed in 2011 in the phase 1 trial. And then the study stopped in 2016. That was 5 years. So that was probably shorter than most. And then access was June this year. So that was 7 years from the start of a patient being dosed to everyone getting access and reimbursement for it. And of course, dollars add up over that time period because there's the preclinical development to the development. And so it's really a long process. And over that time, the first thing we really have to know is it's safe. And then does it work? What's the benefit? That if it actually in the end does show that it works across all medical illnesses, if you don't have access to any alternative therapies, that it gives you early access. So this timeline really shows how long it took for SMA. So the gene was discovered in 1995, and really that was the pathway to develop the treatment. And it was in 2006 that they understood some of the splicing mechanisms about how the gene turned on and turned off. And then they found a compound that worked in cells in 2007, animals in 2009. So it really was an odyssey of 30 years from discovery to treatment. But I think things are speeding up, and we do understand a lot of causes of various nerve and muscle diseases, and I think the pipeline's well established and looking quite promising across the field. And so for SMA, NDU was the type 1, which was the severe form, and the endpoint was survival. And at the end of the study, you can see that the blue line was those babies that were treated before the age of 6 months compared to those that were not treated. And that was the thing. We were blinded. We didn't know who was on treatment and who was not. And at that time, making a decision to participate in that clinical trial meant that you may not get treatment, and some people didn't. So I think there was a lot of, discussion. It was pretty obvious to me that the trial was working, being an investigator. And around, like when you see your baby starting to do stuff they shouldn't be doing, you're like, I think you're on treatment. And it just felt wrong to be continuing the study. And there was a lot of pressure to stop it. And indeed, that's what's happened before the end of the study in 2016. It stopped because it was unethical to be giving people a sham arm in such a devastating disease. And everyone moved over. And there was a compassionate access scheme. So I think I want to keep it more general than just talk about the past in terms of if you're thinking about clinical trials in the future, the benefits are that if it is successful, you'd be one of the first to benefit. Your health is very closely monitored during a trial. You'll see a doctor a hell of a lot more than you would otherwise. The information adds to knowledge. You may actually get improved care around the trial apart from the drug. And it may not work for all patients. It might work for some but not others, and we won't understand that at the start of a trial. But I think there are some downsides. What if it doesn't work? What if it's not safe? What if you get some unexpected side effects? And I think these are all important in making a decision about whether you participate or not. And particularly as you will be seeing doctors a lot more, it's a bit annoying as well to be at hospital so often and getting extra tests. So I think if any of you are thinking about participating in the future, you have to have a long discussion and a very honest discussion with your doctor about what it really means to help you make an informed decision. So what happens when it does work and they get a positive result? I hear for every 100 trials that start, it would happen for one, and we were lucky that we were participating in that one, as were our patients. So I think the lessons, if I am asked to reflect on that, was in terms of trying to get it registered as a therapeutic drug in Australia, where they say, yes, it's safe and it works, and that's when it goes on the TGA. And then you want reimbursement, and that's where the PBS makes a decision. And there's two pathways for that. And I think that the patient voice is very important, and they did listen, and I think there was a lot of community feedback that was given to the PBS about the unmet need and the urgency, and I think that it was expedited much faster than any of us expected, because it really should have still been under review if what we were told was the usual process was to happen. But I think, when you think of an endpoint of survival, that is so coarse. And if that's what they're making a decision on, that really doesn't provide context for what it means day to day for a person. And that's where I think we need to work together as a community to get that message across. And I think there's a lot more work to do, particularly with adult SMA. And I do want to acknowledge that I do feel sad about that, and that adults with SMA don't yet have access. And I think that we all need to work together to make sure the message is heard to help the best decisions be made. Part of the reason, as I understand it, is that the clinical trial was undertaken in children up to the age of 14, and there was no evidence that it worked in adults. And really, I think that there's a responsibility to get that data so that we can go back and try and advocate for that. It's really important. And over lunch, some people have spoken to me and said that there's other drugs coming, and is this going to keep happening for adults who don't have access? And one of the ones I was asked about is a compound by Roche, which is Risdiplam. It's oral. It's a tablet. You don't need needles in your back all the time. And I do understand that it is being tried in adults with SMA as well. So hopefully there's a positive result, and that will help people make a better decision. But I don't want to build up hopes. I'm just saying that the lesson learned is that if you want broad access, you have to have a trial that encompasses people, because decisions can be made on the narrow population in which the trial was done. But that's also very difficult, because you want the trial to be successful. So you've got to try and maximise the chances of success. So I don't know what the right answer is. It is a real juggle, but trying to build a broad research program that covers everybody is something that's important for the future. And one thing that we're currently learning is that once a drug is approved and people do have access, it's only been granted access on data for like 120 people. That's not enough forever. So there is an obligation for the drug company to continue to provide data post-market access, and that's what's called a phase 4 study. And this is where the utility of a registry is really important in being able to gather data across more patients, I think 4,000 patients or more, so that we can understand more about the safety and the long-term benefits of drugs that are newly registered. Because I know there's some drugs, particularly in Duchenne, that have been registered in the US on a trial of 20 patients, and really what they've said is that's conditional registration. They're very high cost, and that really there's an obligation to continue the research, to continue sustained access for people. And so we're in the process of making sure that Australian registries are compatible so that we are able to collect that data. So if anyone is asked to participate in the registry, there is a benefit. So my experience in using nusinersen, I'm treating children because that's what the access and reimbursement is at the moment, is that it is a challenge. It is an intrathecal injection, which is a needle into the spine, and people with scoliosis, it is very tricky and they don't enjoy it, and you can get headaches afterwards from the lumbar puncture. But you know, if the benefit's not big and you're on your back with a cracking headache for 5 days after every needle, some patients say they don't want to continue for that reason. So it's all about the benefit versus the side effects. And I think I'm learning that that's what people are telling me. But also the decision on whether to start treatment, there's limited data, and how much are you willing to put yourself through based on how much benefit it's going to be. The message I hear from the people I talk to, particularly people living with SMA, is that if it stopped me getting worse, I'd do it. And I think that's a very important message, and that's a message that when people ask me, like, but what number, when would you stop at what number, I say it's not about a number of improvement, it's about not getting worse. And I just think we need to be making sure that the voice of the community and what they value in terms of treatment is heard, because the clinical trials are not giving that message about what value of treatment is. They're giving you an endpoint of survival or a number in motor function. And so I think in future clinical trials it's very important to be getting data about what patients want and what they think is beneficial.
So Michelle, how do we advocate that happens?
Well, I think this is the first time I've been through this process myself, but there is a patient representative on the PBAC, and I think she's a very good person, and I'd be trying to engage her and talk to her. I honestly don't know what the right advice is, because I don't want to say go and write 1 million letters to members of parliament, because I don't know if it works, but I think having your voice heard is important. And what I have heard is don't write 3 pages of letters, write 1 paragraph and make it to the point and make it really sharp, because that will be perceived as more important. And I think that there was, when it went up to the PBAC, there was a call for community feedback. And it's not about every person like writing the same message and copy and paste under different names. They can see through that. They really just want to hear what it is in your words. And I have to say, I did really learn to respect the process, and I think they really did listen and in careful detail read all of those comments. And so I think, you know, the fact that PBAC does have a consumer representative on the board is really important, so that that is getting clearly represented. And I think that's becoming increasingly important and very important to respect. We did find it challenging. All of a sudden, when it was registered across Sydney, we had 40 patients all wanting it on the 1st of June. And that was, well, who goes first? Who qualifies? Who waits? How do we do this? And, you know, we have our usual work and limited hospital resources, and we all had to work together. And I think the best thing was education across, and it was working together and educating the community, parents, patients, so that there was no miscommunication. We had a big meeting, everyone was invited, so that there was no missed messages and, oh, they said this to me, no, they said this to me, just being consistent and very fair in the information that we gave. But the most important thing is a drug is not treatment without multidisciplinary care. And if you have drug without multidisciplinary care, you're not getting treatment to me. And it was very, because if you have contractures or if you are malnourished, you're not going to get the benefits of the treatment. So it became more and more important for us to be making sure that our patients are coming to clinic, they're doing their stretches. And in fact, it was actually quite nice because they were more engaged and did make it more of a priority, and I hope that continues. So that's one of our patients getting a lumbar puncture. So I think long discussions with many families weighing up the potential benefits and the costs of treatment. I think the importance of the community and being connected, I think really it's important coming here to speak to Muscular Dystrophy New South Wales that you can't just focus on the positives and the negatives. People did miss out, and I don't think, there's consequences for people that miss out, and anxiety, depression, feeling devalued. I know all those emotions happen, and I'm very saddened to hear it, but I think it's important to acknowledge that, and to also, when you're advocating for political access, to advocate for resources to support people that may miss out, because there are negative consequences of what should be perceived as a positive decision. And similarly, when you're looking to the future and for people that are not yet born who will have SMA, we do know that the earlier you start treatment, the better. So if it is on newborn screening, it's about the people that miss out on that and looking after them and making sure that it's not perceived as a negative thing and devaluing someone else's life, because it shouldn't be. And we need to think broadly and comprehensively across all patient populations and be supporting everybody. And I went through the value of multidisciplinary care and early diagnosis, and we've worked really hard to make sure that our peers are aware to look for the symptoms and the signs of that, and I think there's more work to be done. So my conclusions are that there's a need for more research. This is the beginning. It's like cancer in the 1960s where you got your first chemotherapy. And the survival rates with that were 30%. Now they're 90%. So I do sincerely believe this is the first treatment. I don't think it'll be around forever. I think there'll be better treatments. And so it's really a call for ongoing research to address many of the unknown certainties, developing better treatments. But how long do we need to give it for? Does it work for older people? Does it wear off? Are there side effects down the track? There's so many more questions than answers right now. And I think the most important thing I've learned is listening to your patients and letting them inform you what the key priorities for research are. And one of the key priorities is adult population demonstrating stability as an outcome measure. And I hope that the companies that sponsor these trials see that as a priority and are able to undertake trials so that that need can be addressed. Thanks.
So if there's, of a trial that's happening overseas, is that available, or how do you access those sorts of things, and do we have to go there, or does it come here?
Sometimes it's a difficult answer. We will express interest in various clinical trials and make decisions about what resources we need, that we have the capacity to take on clinical trials. The process of setting up a clinical trial is about 12 months for us. And that goes from a drug company saying, yes, you have adequate resources to do the trial, us saying, yes, we agree that we can do the trial, to then putting it through ethics committee, to then getting adequate training and all the equipment in, to then starting to recruit patients. So it's a long process. So if you found a trial on the internet that was already recruiting and you went to your doctor and said, I want you to set that up for me, it would take 12 months. And the risk of that would be that they'd finished recruiting and then you missed out. The alternative, and we have had patients travel overseas to access treatments, is that it will be very expensive, particularly if you go to the US. If you went there, you would have to pay for all the healthcare. So if they said you need this, this and this to participate in the clinical trial, go and get your gastrostomy, go and get your non-invasive ventilation, now you're meeting standard of care, you have to pay for all of that. And you may well be living overseas for 2 years to participate in that clinical trial. So it's challenging. People do it, and I understand why, because it's important and that's the only option for people, but I don't think that's easy. But if you genuinely think that you want to do that, my suggestion is to talk to your doctor to see what's involved and what the risks and the potential benefits are for that trial before you do move overseas.
So
Do you agree?
I mean, I think it's always worth taking. Is there something always worth taking it to?
I've taken it to the neurologist because that's my first step. You have to have them on board first. But it's in France. So I just believe they're going to human trials next year. So I'm like, well, but how much of that is a reality? You know, we can all have this theory and like, okay, we've got to get on it. Neurologists are saying to me, it has to have measurable outcomes. So a bit difficult for my daughter. For me, it's age. Do you know what I mean? Because it'll go to children first, because they're going to have the most measurable outcomes. So, you know what I mean? It's about weighing up that is it a reality or are we just all...
And how early is the trial?
It's just gone. Yeah.
Like the earlier phase the trial is, the less chance it is that it's going to be successful. Whereas we tend to get involved in trials once they get to the point that they've got much more chance of working. You're in the phase 3 trials, and even then, as Michelle said,
that could take years.
Yeah, I mean,
so I think it's worth bouncing these things around to see where does that trial fall into the scheme of desirable things to do.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, given the expense, if you spent that money doing intensive physio and stretching and exercise, you may get a better outcome potentially. It's tricky. I have tried to set up phase 1 studies, which are the very first studies, because I found the preclinical data compelling, and I don't know if this is the right answer, but I don't think Australia is very desirable for phase 1 studies because our regulatory process is so prolonged. Because it's never been given in humans. The TGA looks at it and that can take 9 months, and by then they might have finished the phase 1 study. So they're going to look at other countries where the regulatory framework is less vigorous to do those studies. So it is quite challenging, and I think that there are some really good people in Australia working to shorten that, because otherwise we don't get access to potential medications that our patients want.
Yeah. So the first step is neurologist, then he finds, because I'm telling him he wasn't aware of it.
That's fair.
And he sort of gave me some realistic, this is really what this entails. I will look into it. But, for me as a reality for planning, is this a reality or is this just...
I think you're doing the right things. I mean, people come to me often with, I've seen this on the internet or this on the internet. I mean, the clinicaltrials.gov site has just reams of clinical trials on it.
Yeah.
And there's very few of those that I would take my child to the States for a trial of. I mean, there might be one. So I think it's fairly easy for us to sit through it with you to work out whether it's one you do. And I've had 2 families go overseas with Duchenne muscular dystrophy for clinical trials, and both of them say they would do it again.
No.
But that's not very many, and it's very, very considered. And we look at what trials we're planning and we're doing and what's coming and what else is on the horizon in other drugs in that space. So I think there's a lot to think about. So I think you're doing the right things to take that step and talk as widely as you can to people.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. It's just about understanding the steps.
Yeah,
because, you're doing a regional hospital that maybe don't have the resources such as Westmead or beyond. But
And the resources to do a clinical trial is almost the same as running a multidisciplinary clinic. So it's not something that is easily done. And to be honest, the hospital doesn't fully fund it, and we're reliant on philanthropy to fill the gaps to be able to do it.
yeah, living in France sounds nice for 2 years, but don't think that's coming.
Michelle, and Christy, what's the research process after a drug like Spinraza is being used now? What's tracking the results of kids on it, and where can that information be found so that we can know whether the results are as they should be, or if...
So there were a total of 11 studies, and they've all been rolled into one, and it's called SHINE, which is an open label extension study. And that's not yet published, but they do give updates at a lot of the international conferences. In fact, I gave the update at Cure SMA this year in June. And what that did show is that the problem with the original study was it was stopped early. So when they reported the results, it was a mixed bag. Some patients had been on it for 3 months, some had been on it for 15 months. And clearly they'd all responded differently because they'd been on it for different times. So it was very hard to dissect the results. And what they said was 40% of people had a motor improvement, which was a little bit underwhelming in some regards. But when they look at the open label extension study and people have had longer on the study now, it's 80% have had a motor milestone improvement. And for SMA type 1, if you couldn't even hold your head up and you were bedbound and you couldn't see the world, even if it meant that you could hold your head upright, you could actually visually interact with the world, which was very meaningful. It also showed that if some people didn't respond, some people develop their first response after a year. So don't give up. It can take a long time to respond. And it even showed that some of the children that met the endpoint of permanent ventilation, they still had motor improvement despite being on a ventilator. And I think for those families caring for those children, they thought that was very important. So I can share that with you. I don't know much more because, but there is an ongoing study. The challenge we have is maintaining our patients on the study, because now they could just flip over to PBS. It would be a hell of a lot easier for them because they wouldn't have to come into hospital and have 2 days of assessments every 4 months. They could just come in and get their drug. But I think it's very important to encourage people to stay on a trial, even if it is post-market access, because it's important to be getting those long-term outcomes in the best possible way to answer it. But I think the registry is also very important because that's such a narrow population. We want to know what the long-term benefit is for everybody across a broad population, and the best way to do that is through a registry that is able to be merged internationally. And so we're in the process of updating the Australian SMA registry so we have the capacity to participate in that.
Thanks. Last question.
In your expertise, in your field, do you have knowledge in cell modifications, and especially with a company called Benetech? I know there's trials in OPMD in America at the moment. I think it's America or the UK. And I just wondered if you know anything about the cell modification trials.
Well, I don't know Benetech. I am an investigator in a gene therapy trial, and I guess that's genetically modifying a cell. But I mean, there's many ways to modify a cell. So I think you'd need to... I just don't know that study to be able to comment on it. But again, I think it comes back to the principles of safety first.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions before we move on?
Thank you, Michelle. Did you mention an SMA? Oh, thank you. Thank you. An SMA register that you want to make sure everybody's on.
Yes.
So how does one go about making sure 2 of your children are on it?
Well, there is one currently, but we're trying to update it. And so the thing is, you have to... Well, it has been, and we have patients on it, but we're trying to update it. But the problem is, if you're an adult with SMA, how do you get access? Because only your clinician can enter it. So the next step that I'm going to be working on is with SMA Australia and other advocacy groups, so the adult population can participate and enter their own data. Because I think it'd be very hard to engage every adult neurologist in Australia to be able to enter it, and I think that's the best way. So watch that space.
I find that, like, SMA Australia do have their adult registry for, like, clinical trials as well. So, yeah, they've definitely put it up there.
That's a community registry. We've got a
Okay.
national one that's curated through the Western Australia Department of Health that actually feeds into the Treat NMD International Registry.
But it's a problem.
Yes, but especially if the child, an SMA child, is very integrated into the community and the workforce and etc., and doesn't actually go to the doctor all the time. There isn't a doctor that's going to register them on the SMA register.
Agreed. Yeah.
Mostly through the support group websites, they'll usually have this, if you can enter yourself.
Yeah. So I think the restriction of the current registry is that you can't enter yourself, and we need to look at that. So there's lots of emails happening at the moment.
I think there was a general sense, a little bit like a Wikipedia thing. People usually thought, well, no, only doctors should enter the data because, it doesn't work if anyone else does it. But actually it's patently clear that people are very far better at entering their own data than any of us are. So that's what's changing.
When we were talking with the PBS about Nusi Nurse, and they said, how many adults in Australia are there with SMA? What are their demographics? We couldn't answer it.
This is where it's ridiculous.
So SMA Australia had to do a quick survey, but I looked at the survey and I don't think it is... I mean, it's got its own pitfalls. As good as it was at the last minute and it was important to do, it's not accurate. So, I mean, not everyone's going to sign up for a registry, I get it, but at least we can try.
Would e-health help that? E-health that's coming out, you can enter, I believe you can enter information.
Yeah, I don't think so, because you have to actually consent to be part of a registry, and that's not part of the consent for e-health. Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.